Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Hudson. And thank you, Dean Welsh isn't here today, and thank you, Brenda, for inviting me as well. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. So as you know, I'm an attorney, which of course overlaps with policy, but what I focus on primarily is women in America that are what I'll call the Middle East diaspora, but I also focus on rule of law and authoritarianism in the Middle East with a focus on Egypt. And what I decided to talk about today was the Syria mass migration / refugee crisis, because I think that that is probably the most serious of the many political problems facing the Middle East. And I wanted to look at it through a gender perspective. And much of it is taking what we've discussed today and effectively applying it to the Syrian refugee crisis. And I want to talk a little bit about the international context, but also the domestic context in the US. Okay, so first, these are kind of the overarching policy questions that are animating my presentation. What should the US and Texas in particular, since this is where we are today, do to protect women's rights in its refugee policies? And more specifically, how can the refugee policies be crafted to address violations of women's rights in the conflict in Syria? Okay, so these are kind of the premise in which I'm operating under. I'm just assuming that this is true. And fortunately, Professor Hudson laid it all out, so now I don't have to worry that, I think I'm just going to crib off of her very persuasive presentation. And then also that gender-based violence is in fact a pervasive problem in what I call the Syrian proxy war. That is effectively what it is at this point, at least based on my analysis. And that gender-based violence affects Syrian women of various religious faiths, because I know there's been a lot of attention on the Yazidi women, and justifiably so, because they have experienced very horrendous forms of gender-based violence. But unfortunately, it's not just them. I mean, this is part of, as we know, a much bigger problem that affects both men and women, but we'll talk about women for today. So this will be the outline. I'll just start with a brief background, talk about data about Syrian refugees abroad, and then also in the US, and then I'll make some policy recommendations. Okay, so just before, I wanted to put this out here because I think people in this audience already know this, but the countries suffering from the biggest casualties of terrorism are Muslim-majority countries. It's not the West. So, because you hear a lot of rhetoric about how this is all just a problem of them hating us and they want to kill us. Well, the terrorists are killing many more Muslims, which are of the same faith that the terrorists claim they are, than they are non-Muslims. Okay, and as you can see, Syria is high up on that list. Now, this is 2013, so Syria is higher now, 3 years later. Okay, this is a very, very simplistic, this is kind of me color-coding just how complex the conflict is. Thus far, I think 1,500 militias have been counted in the Syrian conflict. The local players, there's multiple local players, and what I did is I color-coded the ones that are, we'll say, I wouldn't say allies, but are working in tandem either directly or indirectly, and oftentimes, unfortunately, along sectarian lines. So you have, obviously, the Assad regime, and then you have Hezbollah, and then you have other, Shia militias who aren't necessarily Hezbollah, and then Iran is also backing them from the regional player perspective, and then Russia is backing them from the international perspective. And then you have Daesh, i.e. ISIS, and many of their followers are former Iraqi army officials, and also people there's the foreign fighter elements, which I didn't include in there. And then you have Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, and actually Daesh was a breakoff of Nusra Front after they had a big fight. So they've got Al-Qaeda supporting them. And then you've got the Kurds, which we support the Kurds with the Peshmerga, whether it's directly or indirectly. And also, so Israel hasn't been at the forefront, so I won't talk a lot about its role, but it certainly is playing a role because this is their region. But as you can see, and then you have the Sunni militias, including the Free Syrian Army. So you've got Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the Gulf monarchies. So the point is, it's really complicated. And this is a very, very simplistic rendition. But that also means that the solutions aren't going to be simple. And in some ways, it explains why there hasn't, I mean, it's one of the reasons why it's been very difficult to find a permanent solution and come up with some kind of a peace, a truce, a peace treaty or something. Okay, so with regard to the civilian victims, this has effectively been the largest global refugee crisis since World War II. I mean, we're talking about 7 million displaced within Syria and 4 million outside of Syria. And it just keeps getting bigger because the displaced are the first in line to be the refugees externally. So you have 7 million potential refugees. And as long as the conflict keeps going, those 7 million will try to leave, as justifiably so, because they're facing very dangerous environments in Syria. More than 470,000 people have been killed. And I think many of us know about the use of chemical weapons by Assad himself, forms of ethnic cleansing by Daesh, by ISIS and Assad, and bombings of hospitals. So this has been a very, there are many war crimes that are being committed, let's just put it that way. Okay, so here's a picture of where the refugees are going. And Turkey and Lebanon have quite a bit. Lebanon has 1 in 5. I've heard also, actually 1 in 5 might be too conservative because I've read others, it's 1 in 4 people in Lebanon. So that is also a very sensitive place. And so there are a lot of Lebanese that are very worried about the imbalance that that's creating in terms of the population, particularly because Lebanon already has its own sectarian background of conflict, and many of the Syrians are Sunni. So that's creating a difference of a different balance. And then Turkey has almost 2 million, and Jordan has over 600,000, Iraq 250,000. Okay, so that's just within the region. Now look at Europe, which has also, so 1.3 million as opposed to here, you can see it's still a lot less than the region. But these are just the claims. They're not necessarily the ones that have actually been accepted. The 1.3 million are just people who are seeking asylum, i.e. refugee status, whether through the local process or through the UN process. And as you can see, Germany and Sweden have a very large number, Germany having the largest. Now with regard to the applications that are actually approved, Germany has been the most generous in accepting the Syrian refugees. Now, they're not all Syrian. As you can see, there's Eritrean, Iraqi, Afghani, and Iranian. But a large number of those are Syrian. All right. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S., but I just want you to remember this is what the international community is doing, and then we'll compare it with what the U.S. community, U.S. government is not doing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about women. I have to admit, I did very rigorous research trying to find female-specific data, and it was very difficult. Partly because there's no one on the ground. Journalists, as you know, have been beheaded, and so now there are very few journalists in Syria and in Iraq where ISIS has control, and also it's a war zone. So it's been very difficult to get data, but this is as much as I could find, and I kind of had to put it together. In 2013, so this is 3 years ago, there were at least 38,000 victims of sexual violence. And of course, sexual violence in general is always underreported because of the humiliation and stigma that comes with it. And there, I'll have a chart about rape, but rape is also really hard to track because a lot of women, particularly, and men, don't want to admit it. It's very embarrassing. And so, particularly if you're applying for refugee status, you have a significant evidentiary problem. If you're willing to even talk about it, it's really your word, the woman's word. And that's something that we probably need to make sure that those who are processing them are sensitive to that, because it's not like they can come and say, here's the rape kit to prove it. Here's a quote by the Human Rights Council. So men and women are getting raped. So here is a rendition. The men raped my 2 daughters and my wife forcing them onto the ground to do so. They raped them at the same time. When they began to rape my daughters, they forced me to raise my head and watch. They raped each of them 3 times. Then they forced me out of the chair and ordered me onto the ground. They raped me as well and ordered my wife and children to watch. The men were jeering and said, "Look at your father." They destroyed me. So it's a very, very vicious war. And men are, as you can see from this example, being violated just as much as women are. Okay, with regard to, at least under what I'll call ISIS-controlled territory, and much of this is in the news, sexual slavery is a very serious problem, particularly for the non-Muslim women. So this is where the Yazidis come in, because they have this very warped, skewed, anachronistic interpretation where they pull things out of the Quran, out of battles that happened 1,500 years ago, and try to find a way to justify applying it now and say, okay, we can now make you a sex slave. But that doesn't leave the Muslim women off the hook. So the Muslim women then end up getting forced into marrying the ISIS fighters, and many of them are young. And they're also, and I don't know if this has actually in fact been implemented, but there were reports that ISIS was going to impose mandatory female genital mutilation. And I couldn't find anything to confirm, but there's really no reason to assume they wouldn't do it. And then, of course, there's just murder. So they're obviously murdering. And the murders are not just under ISIS territory, in ISIS territory. But there are also other forms of what I'll call, I hate to use the word voluntary, but it's coerced, but it's coerced because of the circumstances as opposed to through physical force, where now you have families in many of these refugee camps and in other countries that are marrying their daughters off very young because they can't afford to provide for them. And they see it as an act of kindness. They think, well, I'm going to help my daughter if I can find her a husband who is economically stable in that particular country. That person can take care of her. And then there are temporary marriages. So this is a very controversial practice within Islam. It's more common in Shiaism than it is under Sunniism, but there are some people who believe that it is permitted Islamically to engage in these temporary marriages, which for most people, at least within Sunniism, that's just legalized prostitution. But they're using that as a way to have sex with the daughters, and then they pay the dowry, because under Islamic law, the dowry is from the man's family to the woman's family, in contrast to what happens in India. And so effectively they give them the dowry, and the family gets the money, and then they have sex with them for an X amount of time, a certain amount of time, and then they give them back. So that's been something that unfortunately has become more pervasive, particularly in refugee camps. And then you have domestic violence in refugee camps, because there's a lot of depression and the men feel very demasculinized. They feel defeated to the extent that they suffered, both women and men, their own either sexual violence or other types of torture or violence. There's a lot of PTSD and mental health problems that are not treated, and that can then be expressed and manifested through domestic violence in the refugee camps. There's also a lack of access to reproductive health care in the refugee camps, which is creating, you can imagine whether the worst case scenario is if you're raped, but also there's a lot less access to contraception, so women are actually having more babies in refugee camps, even within their marriages, and they don't necessarily want them because they can't afford to keep them. And I'll just tell you, based on my research and understanding of the Middle East, contraception is not as politically sensitive as it is in the U.S. Contraception, at least, and I'm speaking primarily from an urban perspective, but my experience with it, when this is anecdotal, is that women tend not to like to use contraception when they first get married to make sure they can actually have babies. But after that, using it is not considered necessarily against the religion. It's more of a minority view and very, very conservative, very traditional communities. So this is something that they're adapted or are used to having, at least contraception. Also, because of the 470,000 people that have been killed, many of whom are men, you now have increasingly women as heads of households. 1 in 4 of them is the estimate, which of course makes them more vulnerable to violence, and it also makes their children more vulnerable to perhaps having to be married off again as a child bride, or other forms of survival and vulnerability. This is just a chart I found. I'm going to assume that, this is a human rights organization, so it's really identifying trends and not taking these numbers as accurate in and of themselves. But this is the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and this is from kind of on the ground fact finding. But they show the number of women. Now, according to them, they're showing that the government forces kill the vast majority of women, but because the conflict is very political, it's hard to tell which. But the point is, there are a lot of, obviously, women that are being killed. This is from the Women's Media Center. And unfortunately, this chart doesn't show the total, it just shows the percentages, but it just gives you an idea of how, at least when it comes to sexual violence, one, women are more of a victim than men, and two, that rape and multiple attackers, which presumably means rape as well, is the most prevalent form. Okay, so as you can see, the situation, the factual background is very bad and mandates something. We have to do something, not just for Syrian women, but also for Syrian refugees in general. Now let's look at the American context. So the laws are the Refugee Act of 1980, which was essentially the law that adopted the definition of the UN Convention's definition on what a refugee is, and also increased the cap, which can be changed by the president. And then we have asylum law, which is under the Immigration Nationality Act. And the difference between being a refugee and asylum under American law is that asylum is you're here in the US and you request asylum, or you go to an embassy abroad if you can actually get in the embassy and ask for asylum, which is usually very difficult to actually, because you have to physically be there. And then a refugee is you're outside the country and you're asking to come in. Okay, so this is the definition: well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And if you are a persecutor, you are disqualified, even if in fact you were also persecuted. Now, this is what many people in the public do not realize surrounding the Syrian refugee debate, which is don't let them in because they're all potential terrorists, is it's very, very difficult to be a refugee that's certified by the UN and to get to the US. And you don't get to pick where you go if the UN does approve you. So only 1% of those applying, 21-step vetting process. And as you can see, every national security and defense agency is involved in vetting. And it takes 18 to 24 months to even get here from the beginning to the end. So this is a major fallacy, or these are facts that are not being communicated clearly, I think, to the public. Now, for those that are already here, we give temporary protected status, not just to Syrians. We've given them to people in Central America when there were conflicts, and those are people who may not qualify for asylum, so they can't show I have a well-founded fear of persecution based on that criteria, but it's effectively, if I go back, it's a war and I'll get killed. So we give them this temporary protected status so that they can work. Thus, it's usually every 2 years, and it's just been renewed to 2018 for Syrians. And in Texas, we have thus far in the last 20 years accepted 100,000 refugees. This is a major destination for refugees in the United States. These are not Syrian, obviously, refugees, but so this just gives you a breakdown of some of the refugees in the last 3 years. So this year, in 2015, Burma, and then Iraq, and then Somalia. Those were the largest. This is inside the U.S., all that came, again, Iraq, Burma, Somalia, Iraq, Burma, Bhutan, Somalia. And as you see, Syria is at the very bottom. It's not even on the list in 2014 and 13. And this is all refugees, but again, in the last 5 years, Texas has received 41,000 refugees. I had very much hoped that our congressperson were here, because this was to show him that. And then these are the states who have attempted, have attempted unavailingly to deny refugees to come in, particularly Syrian refugees, primarily because they can't legally. Immigration law is under federal jurisdiction, and they do not have the legal authority to determine or decide who comes in and out of the country. And the federal government pays the states for the resettlement. but they cannot deny them entry into the United States. Okay. But as you can see, we've only allowed it's between 2,800 to 3,100 Syrian refugees, which is nothing. I mean, think 1.9 million in Turkey, 1.3 million in Europe. So from the international perspective, we don't really look very good in front of our international colleagues, the other countries in the international community. And this is the budget, the annual budget that is given to the various states from the federal government, and the way in which the resettlement services are provided depends on the state. We have a private public partnership in Texas, so you have things like Catholic Charities, but also you have state agencies. Okay. So I have to wrap up, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is essentially stating what many of you may already know, which is that refugees contribute a lot to the economy. And there's a great case study in Cleveland. With regard to the terrorism allegations, 750,000 refugees, only 3 have been charged with terrorism, 1 domestic and 2 international. Of the 2,800 Syrians, none that have come in. And so there is no evidence that they are a threat to national security. Okay, I'll get to the policy recommendations. The first 2 are kind of pie in the sky, but I had to put it out there as the very beginning, which is obviously we need a permanent solution. And the second one is what some others have brought up, which is when we do work on that permanent solution, we need to make sure women are at the table, Syrian women are at the table. I think that having research and commission and research on how Syrian refugees have contributed to the U.S. economy, and also how they've contributed to European economy, can help to show that there's no reason why we shouldn't let them in. Now, with regard to women, I would suggest, or I recommend, a quota for victims of gender-based violence, so really increase that and create some preferential treatment, which would qualify under P2, because there's 3 levels for refugees, so it would be the vulnerable humanitarian, but to increase that and be very proactive about it. I increase the admission of female head of households, and increase preferences for family reunification, because that also can help them integrate better and have a support group. I think one of the things we don't do a good job of in many areas, but let's say in refugee resettlement, is leveraging the skills of Arab and Muslim American NGOs, because they have a lot of skills that they can help to assist, for example, on gender-based issues. And then finally, this goes to what some others were talking about, which is many of the refugee camps, actually the women are very entrepreneurial, and they're starting their own businesses. So to the extent that it's infeasible to bring more women here, we've spent $3.7 billion, the US, since the Syrian conflict. Make sure that a portion of that helps the women in the refugee camps become more economically independent, and that hopefully will at least lead to less violence against them so that they can be more self-reliant. Okay, and finally, this is just a picture of the Bush School students who went, and they're working with the International Rescue Committee to help them in refugee resettlement and obtaining grants. So I just thought that was a proud moment for the Bush School. All right, thank you very much.